The Achilles heel of the sub was the composite cylinder that was the main hull that the people were inside. There were two titanium end caps on each end. They are relatively intact on the seafloor, but that carbon fiber composite cylinder is now just in very small pieces, and it's all rammed into one of the hemispheres. So it's pretty clear that that's what failed. The question is, was it the primary failure or a secondary failure from something else happening?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. According to Peter Pixel, quote, a viral 3D animation that gives a detailed explanation as to what happened to Oceangate's Titan sub has already racked up 7.6 million views. AI Telly released their video on YouTube rendering a 3D animation in 4K, pointing the finger at Titan's experimental design. The narrator explains that existing submarine technology is based around steel, titanium, and aluminum, but the Titan used mostly carbon fiber, end quote. Recreations, reenactments, and animations play an important role in true crime, and if anything, are underutilized. So kudos to AI Telly for trying, and also for, one supposes, basing his animation of the wreckage that was seen offloaded on June 28th. I say that because AI Telly's animation came out on June 30th, 2 days later. One aspect that has not been discussed very much, if at all, are the two glass spheres that could also have been the weak link in terms of this experimental design.
There are actually three potential failure points, and the investigation hopefully can localize it down to exactly what happened. The viewport in the front was an acrylic viewport. I'm told it was rated to less depth than they were diving it to, which is one point. They also had two glass spheres on the sub, small glass spheres for flotation, which is a bad idea. Those are prone to failure over time. But I think the weakest link, if I had to put money down on what the finding will be, the Achilles heel of the sub was the composite cylinder that was the main hull that the people were inside.
In this episode, I'm going to try and take what we know and what we have speculated on further. I'm going to try and advance our knowledge on precisely what happened when the Titan imploded. In other words, taking that animation further and fleshing it out even more than it has already been. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So the point of this particular episode is to try and extend what we know, and certainly the 3D animation that so many people have watched, and see if we can provide a little bit more information and a little bit more perspective to that situation. So I've got three suggestions. Number one, the carbon fiber cylinder wouldn't deform like a soda can as you see in that animation, but rather it would shatter like glass into pieces. It would really splinter rather than deform. That is how metal would deform, but this is not a metal, so that would break into pieces. Number two, we know that after the vessel imploded, it fragmented, blowing out the acrylic window and blowing apart both hemispheres, the frames, the tail, and the landing gear. And then number three,
may I suggest you yield to the experts on this one?
I'm not trying to be funny when I say that. I do think we need to look at what James Cameron said in an interview with ABC News. I played it at the beginning of this particular video. So as early as June 23rd, in other words, even prior to the release of the wreckage, remember the wreckage was unloaded, I think, on June 28th. So 5 days before that, James Cameron did an interview with ABC News, and he speculated that the imploded hull fragments would have blown into one of the hemispheres. You heard that at the beginning. Let me play that again.
There were 2 titanium end caps on each end. They are relatively intact on the seafloor, but that carbon fiber composite cylinder is now just in very small pieces, and it's all rammed into one of the hemispheres.
So again, you hear him speculating that the imploded hull fragments have blown into one of the hemispheres. Now, bear in mind, we're dealing with an engineer, and not only an engineer, but an engineer who knows submersibles. I've listened to the interview a few times, and it's hard to know if Cameron knew the answer due to context in the industry, if he's telling us something that he already knows kind of after the fact, or whether he was making an educated guess. Whatever the answer is, the fact is, when one looks at the footage of the wreckage being offloaded, and I'll put a couple of links to that in the description as well. When you watch the wreckage being offloaded, the one component we don't see is the windowless titanium hemisphere. Where is it? Why don't we see that? Let me ask that question again. What fragment is clearly missing from these images? And let's go through them one by one. We see the front titanium dome. We see the frame. We see the rear top part of the vessel. We see the struts connecting it to the undercarriage. We see the sort of rear wing. And so what's missing? What is missing from these images? Well, it's definitely the windowless titanium hemisphere. I'm afraid I don't have any snazzy animation software, so you're going to have to put up with the booby prize in terms of this, which is just my imagination. Again, I'm no engineer, but based on James Cameron's scenario, what I see happening in my imagination when I imagine it, I see an implosion of the central cylinder, and the next part is pretty horrific. You have super pressurized water racing to fill the relatively much lower pressured capsule at such speed that 2 things happen. On the one end, the acrylic window is literally blown off, and we know it is blown off because we've seen that hemisphere. We can see even the bolts are gone. On the other end, and as a result of the air blowing out of the window at a super accelerated rate. And so what happens is the carbon fiber and all 5 people likely got smashed and crushed into the other hemisphere, which is why A, human remains were recovered, B, the windowless hemisphere hasn't been seen, and C, the carbon fiber fragments haven't been seen either. In order to imagine what I've just mentioned, imagine a balloon blown up that's released, except instead of flying around at a sedate clip, it blasts off at the speed of a bullet, even faster. Well, you can imagine what happens to what's inside that balloon. Another analogy is an elevator that free falls and then abruptly hits the ground. What happens to those inside? Well, they'll be propelled against the ceiling of the elevator. In other words, the windowless titanium hemisphere. Does that make sense? I think you'll agree that the 3D animation from AI Tele doesn't quite tell the story of that implosion in a way that's exactly accurate. It begins to tell that story. I think the end of that story is the windowless titanium hemisphere. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.